The village elder told him to turn the orc away. The old farmer just locked his door and let her stay. Elian had lived on the edge of the world for so long he'd forgotten the shape of other men's faces. His farm was the last stubborn tooth in a jawbone of failing homesteads, clinging to the stony soil where the king's lands frayed into the shadow of the Broken Tusk mountains. The wind that swept down from those peaks carried the scent of iron and cold stone, and sometimes the faint guttural calls of the orcs who claimed them. He knew the sounds, he knew the smell, he knew the fear they were meant to inspire. Fear was a neighbor he had long since learned to ignore. He was an old man, carved from the same tough, unyielding timber as the beams of his house. His hands were maps of a life spent wresting a living from the earth. Calluses were his mountains, scars his rivers. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of someone who knew that wasted motion was wasted life. His days were a ritual of chores, a silent conversation with the land and the livestock. He rose with the grey light, milked his one cow, fed the chickens, mended the fence that was always threatening to collapse, and worked the stubborn plot of land that gave him just enough to endure. His world was small, contained by the dry stone walls he had built with his own hands decades ago. It was a world of quiet, of solitude, of a peace that was really just a long, drawn-out truce with loneliness. The night she came was a brute. Rain fell not in drops but in sheets, turning the path to his door into a churning river of black sludge. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at the shingles of his roof and rattling the single glass pane in his window. Elian sat by his hearth, the fire a lone spot of warmth in the vast, roaring dark. He was mending a leather strap for the cow's bell, his fingers moving with practiced surety, when a sound that was not the storm broke his concentration. It was a heavy, wet thud against his door. He froze, the awl held tight in his fist. Nothing came to his door. Traders gave his farm a wide berth, and the folk from the village, a full day's walk away, had long since written him off as a hermit, half mad from isolation. The only visitors this close to the mountains were unwelcome ones. He listened, his breath held tight in his chest. The storm raged, but beneath it, he heard it again. A scraping sound, a groan that was swallowed by a gust of wind. He set the strap down, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He took the iron poker from the hearth, its weight familiar and grimly comforting. He moved to the door, the floorboards groaning under his boots. He did not ask who was there. There was no point. Anyone with good intentions would have shouted. He lifted the heavy iron bar from its brackets and cracked the door open a finger's width. The wind tore it from his grip, slamming it open against the interior wall. Rain and fury blasted into his small home, scattering embers from the hearth. And there, collapsed on his doorstep, was a nightmare given form. An orc. A woman. She was huge, a creature of muscle and raw power even in her state of collapse. Her skin was the color of moss-covered stone, her hair a wild black mane plastered to her skull by the rain. A jagged tusk, broken near the tip, jutted from her lower lip. She wore piecemeal armor of dark, hammered iron and thick leather, all of it scarred and battered. A deep, ragged gash ran from her shoulder down her side, oozing black blood that mingled with the rain and mud. In one hand, she still clutched the hilt of a brutal, short-bladed sword. His first instinct was primal. Fear. Slam the door, bar it, let the storm and whatever hunted her finish the job. The village elders spoke of orcs as monsters, child-eaters, savages who burned and pillaged for sport. He had seen the smoke from sacked outposts on the horizon in his youth. He had no reason to doubt them. But then she moved. Her head lifted a fraction of an inch, and one eye, a startling chip of yellow gold, found his. There was no malice in it, no rage, only a vast, bottomless exhaustion, and a flicker of something that looked like defiance. It was the look of a cornered wolf, too wounded to run, but still ready to die fighting. He saw the faint lights then, torches, bobbing and weaving through the trees at the edge of his clearing. The wind carried their shouts, faint but clear, orcish, harsh and guttural. They were hunting her. Something inside him broke. Some old, rusted latch of caution and good sense gave way. He looked at the creature bleeding out on his doorstep, then at the torches of the things coming to finish her. He had lived a life of turning away from the world, from other people, from the memory of his wife and son in the cold ground. He was tired of turning away. He jammed the poker into the hook by the door, bent down and hooked his arms under her. The weight was immense, a solid mass of muscle and bone and cold, wet iron. He grunted, his old back screaming in protest, and dragged her inside. The smell of her filled the small room, wet pine, cold mud, and the sharp, metallic bite of blood. He kicked the door shut against the storm and dropped the heavy bar back into place. The sound of its seating was a final, irrevocable boom. The torches were closer now. He could see them clearly through the window. He moved quickly, extinguishing his single lamp and kicking dirt over the embers in the hearth, plunging the room into near total darkness. He stood by the window, a shadow in the shadows, and watched as 3 hulking orc shapes entered his clearing. They were males, broader and more bestial than the female lying on his floor. They carried cruel-looking axes and followed a set of tracks that ended abruptly at his door. He held his breath. His knuckles were white where he gripped the window frame. This was it. This was the stupid, noble act that would be the end of him. He thought of his wife, of the quiet life he had built from the ashes of his grief, and he found he was not afraid, just tired. The orcs conferred in their harsh tongue. One of them pointed at the door with his axe. Another shook his head, gesturing back toward the mountains. The storm was worsening, a biblical deluge. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the leader grunted an order. They turned and lumbered back into the woods, swallowed by the rain and the dark. The torches vanished. Elian let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It shuddered out of him, thin and shaky. He was alone again, with the storm and the dying orc on his floor. He felt his way back to the hearth and coaxed a few embers back to life, shielding the faint glow with his body. In the low, flickering light, he looked at her. She was unconscious now, her breathing shallow and ragged. The wound in her side was worse than he'd thought. It was deep, and it was filthy. He knew what he had to do. His wife had been the village healer. He had watched her work 1,000 times, had learned more from her than he'd ever learned from a book. He fetched the wooden chest from under his bed. It smelled of dried herbs and memories. He pulled out clean linen, a needle threaded with gut, and a jar of pungent comfrey salve. He boiled water over the small, rekindled fire. Working by the faint, uncertain light, he cut away the stiff, blood-soaked leather of her tunic. The skin beneath was a landscape of old scars, a testament to a life of violence. But the new wound was a raw, gaping canyon in her flesh. He cleaned it as gently as he could, his touch surprisingly steady. She stirred and groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure pain. Her hand snapped up and locked around his wrist, fast, brutal, even dying. The strength in her grip was terrifying. It was like being caught in an iron trap. Her yellow eye was open, blazing with feverish intensity in the dim light. She could kill him, right here, snap his arm, crush his windpipe. It would be easy for her. He did not pull away. He did not struggle. He simply met her gaze, his own eyes calm and weary. He held up the needle and thread in his other hand. "It needs closing," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Or you'll die." She stared at him, her gaze boring into him, searching for deceit, for weakness, for motive. He offered none. He was just an old man with a needle, trying to stop a life from leaking out onto his floorboards. What could he possibly want from her? "Lady, if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this." The thought was so clear, it was almost as if he'd spoken it aloud. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure on his wrist eased. Her hand fell away, limp. Her eye closed. It was not trust, not yet. It was resignation. She was too weak to fight him, too weak to stop him. She was letting this happen because she had no other choice. "Go ahead." The words were not spoken. They were a whisper of thought in the space between them, a concession. He went back to work. His stitches were small and neat, a farmer's practical mend on a living garment. He packed the wound with the salve and bound it tightly with clean linen. He covered her with his own worn woolen blanket, the only one he owned. He sat back on his heels, his work done. He had invited a monster into his home, barred the door against her kin, and then stitched her back together. He had to be mad. He spent the rest of the night in his chair by the cold hearth, listening to the storm rage outside and the wounded orc breathe inside. He did not sleep. He just watched and waited for the dawn. The next 2 days were a blur of fever and shallow breaths. He forced water and thin broth between her lips, a few drops at a time. He kept the fire low and steady. He changed her dressings. He moved about his small house with a renewed, if reluctant, sense of purpose. He was no longer just enduring. He was caregiving. On the 3rd morning, he woke in his chair to find her watching him. The fever had broken. Her yellow eye was clear and sharp, and it missed nothing. The suspicion was still there. a hard, protective shell around her. But beneath it, there was a flicker of something else. Confusion. He rose stiffly and ladled some stew into a wooden bowl. He placed it on the floor beside her, along with a cup of water. He said nothing. He just went about his morning chores, acutely aware of her gaze following his every move. When he came back inside, the bowl was empty. That was the beginning of their silence. They did not speak. Words were a currency they did not share, and perhaps did not trust. Their communication became a language of action. When he went to chop wood, she followed, leaning heavily against the door frame. She watched him work, his movements slow but efficient. The next day, while he was tending to the cow, she took the axe. With her one good arm, she began to split the logs he had piled up. The motion was awkward, jarring to her wounded side, but she worked with a grim, relentless determination until a respectable pile of firewood lay stacked by the door. She was contributing, paying her way. He found her one afternoon sharpening his spare axe head with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was the only sound in the clearing. The edge she put on it was keener than any he had managed in years. It was a warrior's edge, meant for something other than wood. He began to leave his hunting knife on the table for her. She would clean and oil it, her large, scarred hands surprisingly deft. In return, he started leaving a larger portion of stew for her, with more meat in it. A silent negotiation. A fragile truce built on mutual, practical need. He learned the rhythm of her pain. He knew when her wound was aching by the slight tightening of her jaw, the way she held her body unnaturally still. He would leave a cup of willow bark tea by her sleeping spot without a word. She would drink it without acknowledgement. But the next morning, the fire would be lit before he woke. The small kindness returned in kind. One evening, a week after her arrival, he fell asleep in his chair again, exhausted from a long day of turning the soil in his garden. The ache in his bones was a constant companion. He dreamt of his wife, of her warm smile and the scent of baking bread. When he woke in the deep of the night, the fire had been banked to a soft, warm glow, and his heavy woolen blanket was tucked carefully around his shoulders. He looked over at the corner where she slept. She was a mound of shadows, but he could feel her wakefulness. She was watching him. He didn't move. He just sat there, under the warmth of the blanket she had placed over him, and for the first time in a long, long time, the crushing weight of his solitude felt a little bit lighter. It was a vulnerable gesture, a crack in the stone wall she had built around herself, an admission that she saw him not just as a tool for her survival, but as a person. The thaw continued, slow and almost imperceptible, like the retreat of a glacier. They began to share the evenings by the fire. He would mend his tools, and she would work on her battered armor, hammering out dents with a smooth riverstone. The comfortable silence was sometimes broken by a single word. "Wood," she would say, her voice a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. And he would nod, understanding she meant the pile was getting low. Rain, he would state, looking at the sky. And she would help him bring the chickens into the coop. One night, as he stared into the flames, the memories came unbidden. "My wife," he said, the words feeling strange and heavy in his mouth. She planted the herbs by the door, said a home wasn't a home without them. The orc woman, whose name he still did not know, stopped her work. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. She didn't offer sympathy. Orcs, he was learning, did not deal in such flimsy things. She simply listened. "We had a son," he continued, the words a trickle, then a slow stream. "He had her eyes. Took a fever one winter. Nothing she did could stop it. She followed him a season later. Said the world was too quiet without his laughter." He fell silent, the old grief a familiar weight. "This farm is all I have left of them." He had revealed the core of his life, the reason for his isolation. He had handed her the fragile, broken pieces of his past. He expected nothing in return. She was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Then she spoke, her voice still rough but softer than he'd ever heard it. "Corgul," she said. It was just a name, but it was offered like a piece of a puzzle. "He was my second," she added after another long pause. "He took what was not his. My command, my clan." She touched the broken tusk at her lip. "He gave me this, a reminder." The trail, high status. He began to understand. She was not some common raider. She was a leader, cast out and hunted by her own kind. Her isolation mirrored his, though its cause was violence, not grief. In that moment, by the dying fire, they were not a man and an orc. They were just two solitary beings, sharing the weight of their respective pasts. The quiet rhythm of their life was shattered by the arrival of the village bailiff. Bailiff Malthus was a thick, pompous man whose authority was derived entirely from the iron-studded cudgel he wore at his belt, and the two lanky, slack-jawed deputies who flanked him. Elian saw them coming from a long way off, 3 dark figures moving purposefully up his path. The orc woman, Graka he had started calling her in his mind, for she had the grace of a hunting hawk, had seen them too. She melted back into the shadows of the cottage, his hunting knife appearing in her hand as if by magic. Elian met them by the gate, his face a passive mask. "Elian," Malthus grunted, not bothering with pleasantries. "There are rumours, talk in the village, that you're harbouring a savage." "I'm harbouring myself, bailiff," Elian said, his voice flat. "Same as always." "Don't play games with me, old man," Malthus sneered, his hand resting on his cudgel. "We heard the commotion during the storm last week. Orc shouts. Someone saw tracks near your land. You let one of those beasts in your home." The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. To shelter an orc was treason. It was an invitation for the whole village to descend on his farm with torches and pitchforks. He thought of the blanket she had placed over him, of the quiet companionship that had filled the empty spaces in his home. "My home is my own," Elian said, his voice quiet but as unyielding as the stone walls behind him. "What I do in it is my own affair." "Not when it endangers the village," one of the deputies squawked. Malthus stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. "The council demands it, Elian. If you have an orc in there, you will turn it over to us. Now, for your own good." Elian looked past him, at the village he had long since left behind. A place of petty fears and narrow minds. He looked back at his own front door, behind which a wounded warrior had shown him more quiet decency than he'd received from his own kind in 20 years. "No," he said. The word was small, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. Malthus's face went purple. "No? You defy the council? You choose a beast over your own people?" "I choose who I allow to cross my threshold," Elian replied. "And it isn't you." He turned his back on them and walked back to his cottage, shutting the door firmly behind him. He did not bar it. It was a statement. He was not afraid of them. He heard Malthus sputtering threats and curses outside. They lingered for a few more minutes, then left, their angry shouts fading down the path. He had drawn a line. He had cast his lot. Graka emerged from the shadows, the knife still in her hand. Her yellow eyes searched his face, questioning. Why? He didn't have an answer she would understand. He just shrugged and went to stir the stew simmering over the fire. "They're more trouble than they're worth," he muttered. It was the simplest explanation for a choice that was anything but. He felt her gaze on his back, heavy with a new, complex weight. It was the first time, he thought, that anyone had ever chosen her. The visit from Malthus was a warning. The world was closing in. 2 days later, Elian found the real sign. It was carved into the largest of the ancient oaks that marked the edge of his property, a crude, jagged symbol of a bloody tusk. Korgal's mark. He ran his fingers over the raw cuts in the bark. They were fresh. They knew where she was. He showed it to Graka. She stared at the symbol, her face hardening into a mask of cold fury. She didn't need to say anything. The hunt was no longer distant. It was at their door. That night they prepared. He showed her the weak points in his stone walls, the hidden game trails he used for hunting, the small, defensible rise behind the barn. She, in turn, showed him how to use his wood axe, not just for splitting logs, but as a weapon. How to stand, how to swing, how to use its weight to break a shield or a bone. Her instructions were terse, physical. She would move his body into the correct position, her touch firm and impersonal. He was clumsy, old, not a warrior, but he learned. The first attack came 3 nights later, under the sliver of a new moon. Not a war band, a scouting party, 5 of them. They moved like shadows, intending to take the cottage by surprise. But Graka was not surprised. She had been waiting, perched on the roof of the barn like a great stone gargoyle. She let out a single, sharp cry. Not a scream of fear, but a battle cry, a challenge. It cut across the clearing like iron breaking. Elian was where she had told him to be, hidden in the woodpile with a heavy pitchfork. He had set a tripwire, a simple rope tied to a stack of precariously balanced logs. As the first 2 orcs charged the cottage door, he pulled the rope. The logs cascaded down, a clumsy but effective avalanche of timber. One orc went down with a shattered leg, howling in pain. The other stumbled, momentarily losing his footing. It was all the opening Graka needed. She descended from the roof not like a person, but like a falling rock. She landed on the stumbling orc's shoulders, driving him to the ground with her sheer weight, and her knife found the soft spot under his jaw. It was brutal, efficient, and horrifying. The remaining 3 hesitated, shocked by the ferocity of the defense. That hesitation cost them. Elian, his heart hammering against his ribs with a terror so profound it felt like courage, charged from the woodpile. He drove the pitchfork into the thigh of the nearest orc, just as Graka had shown him, using his whole body, not just his arms. The orc roared and swiped at him with a massive axe. Elian scrambled back, falling over his own feet. The axe whistled through the air where his head had been. Before the orc could swing again, Graka was there. Her movements were a blur of deadly grace. Even injured, even outnumbered, she was a storm of violence. Her short sword, a weapon he hadn't seen her use before, sang in the moonlight. She parried, dodged, and thrust. She fought not with rage, but with a cold, focused precision. It was the work of a master craftsman. Only her craft was death. In less than a minute, it was over. 5 bodies lay still in the dirt of his farmyard. The silence that descended was more profound than the violence that had preceded it. It was broken only by their ragged breathing. Graka stood over the last orc she had felled. She was bleeding from a fresh cut on her arm, and her wounded side was clearly paining her, but she stood tall. She looked at Elian, who was still on the ground, the pitchfork held in a white-knuckled grip. Her gaze was different now. The last remnants of suspicion were gone, burned away in the heat of the fight. In its place was something new. Respect. He had not run. He had not cowered. He had stood his ground. He had fought. Badly, clumsily, but he had fought. For her. One of the scouts was not quite dead. He lay gasping, his life bubbling away from a deep wound in his chest. Graka knelt beside him, her face grim. She spoke to him in their harsh tongue. He answered in a weak, gurgling whisper. Korgul sends regards to the blood thane. The dying orc rasped. His eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and awe. He looked from her to Elian. He will enjoy killing your human pet. Then he was silent. Graka remained kneeling for a long moment. Elian got to his feet, his legs trembling. The name the scout had used echoed in his mind. Blood thane. It sounded important. It sounded dangerous. He looked at the woman he had pulled from the mud, the woman who split his firewood and sharpened his tools. He had seen her as a refugee, a fellow solitary soul. But she was more, so much more. He felt a sudden, chilling chasm open between them. He was an old farmer, a nobody. She was a thane. Whatever that meant, it was a world away from him. He had been tending to a wounded queen, and he hadn't even known it. The quiet partnership he thought they had built suddenly felt like a lie, a deception on her part. He had offered his home, his loyalty, his very life, to a stranger who had not even given him her real name or station. He felt a fool, a small, insignificant man caught up in the great, grinding gears of a world he did not understand. The sense of betrayal was a cold, bitter stone in his gut. She finally rose and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, carved from stone. Graka, she said, her voice low. She pointed to herself. I am Graka, blood thane of the Iron Fang. The full truth, offered too late. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He just nodded, the motion stiff and awkward. He turned and walked away to fetch his shovel. They had bodies to bury before the sun came up. The easy silence between them was broken, replaced by the heavy weight of her title and his own fresh, stinging hurt. The final siege came with the dawn. They came not as a scouting party, but as a war band. At least 30 of them, their iron-shod boots churning the morning mist. They were led by a massive orc with a scarred face and a single polished tusk that gleamed in the grey light. Corgal. He carried a huge two-handed axe and wore an air of brutal authority. With him were not just warriors, but a handful of other orc women, their faces grim and watchful. Her loyalists, Elian realized, brought to her as prisoners or hostages. They surrounded the small farmhouse, a ring of grim, patient iron. There would be no escape. The flimsy defenses they had prepared seemed laughable now. A tripwire and a pile of logs against an army. His small home, his entire world, had become a tomb. Corgal stepped forward, his voice a roar that seemed to shake the very air. Graka, you hide behind this human's pathetic walls. The blood thane of the Iron Fang, reduced to sheltering with a soft-skinned farmer. Come out and face your judgment. The door to the cottage opened. Graka stepped out. She had donned the rest of her armor, the pieces she had been painstakingly mending by the fire. It was still battered and scarred, but on her it looked regal. She held her short sword in one hand, and in the other the wood axe he had sharpened for her. She looked every bit the thane she was. Elian stood in the doorway behind her, armed with his pitchfork and a lifetime of stubbornness. He was terrified, but he would not let her stand alone. Corgal? Graka's voice was not loud, but it cut through the morning air, sharp and clear. You are a craven who attacks the wounded in their sleep. You have no honor. You have no claim. Corgal laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Honor is for the victorious, and your claim died the moment you fled to the arms of this thing. He spat on the ground. Your loyalists thought you were strong. I showed them your weakness. He gestured to the captive orc women. They will watch you die. Then they will serve me. The battle, when it came, was short and brutal. There was no strategy, no cleverness. It was a wave of violence crashing against a small stone wall. Graka met the first charge like a rock splitting a tide. She was magnificent, a whirlwind of steel and fury. She moved with a purpose that was terrifying to behold, her axe and sword a blur, cutting down any who came within her reach. Elian fought by the door, a desperate, hopeless defense. He was not a warrior. He jabbed with his pitchfork, keeping them at bay, using the narrow doorway as a choke point. He was wounded twice, a deep gash on his arm, a glancing blow to his head that made the world swim. He saw one of Corgal's warriors break past Graka's defense, brandishing a flaming torch. The orc hurled it onto the thatched roof of the cottage. The dry thatch caught instantly. Flames roared to life, consuming the roof, consuming his home, consuming the last 40 years of his life. The smell of burning memories filled the air. Everything he had, everything he was turning to ash. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw Graka falter. She was tiring, bleeding from a dozen small cuts. Corgal saw it too. He pushed through his warriors, his great axe raised, ready for the final blow. But then, something shifted. One of the captive women, a tall, fierce-looking orc with a shock of white hair, let out a piercing shriek. She threw herself at the guard nearest her, biting and clawing. It was a signal. The other loyalists surged into action, turning on their captors. The battle devolved into a chaotic, swirling melee. In that moment of chaos, Graka did not press her attack. She turned. She looked past the warriors, past the usurper, past the flames consuming her sanctuary. She looked at Elian. He was leaning against the burning doorframe, bleeding, battered, his world incinerated around him. He met her gaze through the haze of smoke. She raised her voice, and it carried over the din of battle, a proclamation of iron will. Hear me, Iron Fang. Korgal says I am weak because I took shelter here. He is wrong. I found strength here. I found honor. She strode through the fighting, which seemed to part before her. She stopped in front of Elian, placing herself between him and the battle. She was shielding him. This man, Elian, took in a stranger. He defended the helpless. He stood against his own kind for what was right. He has more honor in his farmer's hands than you have in your entire warband, Korgal. She turned to him then, her yellow eyes blazing with an intensity that burned brighter than the fire behind him. Her voice dropped, but it was still a public declaration meant for all to hear. I, Graka, Bloodthane of the Iron Fang, claim this man. He is of my hearth. He is under my protection. Any who harm him answer to me. I offer you a place, Elian, beside me, as we reclaim what is mine. The offer hung in the smoky air, a future, a place, a life beyond the ashes of this one. It was a queen's decree, a public, political act of defiance. She was not just saving him, she was binding him to her cause, in front of her people and her enemies. He looked at her, this warrior queen who had shared his stew and his silence. He looked at the smoking ruins of his home, the grave of his past. There was nothing left for him here. His old life was gone, burned away. The only thing left was the choice she was offering him. He pushed himself off the charred doorframe, his body screaming in protest. He was covered in soot, blood, and the dust of his destroyed life. He felt small and human and utterly out of his depth. But he also felt seen. She wasn't offering to protect a pet. She was offering a partnership to the man who had stood his ground. I accept, he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. He took a steadying breath. On one condition. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. A human, a farmer, making conditions to a bloodthane in the middle of a battle. I will not be your dependent, he said, his voice gaining strength. I will not hide behind your shield. I am a farmer, I am a man. I will stand beside you as I am, or not at all. It was his own declaration, his own claim of worth. He would not be ashamed of what he was. He was not a warrior, and he would not pretend to be. But he had his own strength, his own honor, and he would not have it be diminished. A slow smile spread across Graka's face. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. It transformed her harsh features into something beautiful and fierce. Then stand, she said. She turned back to the battle, and he stood beside her. The sight of them together, the towering orc thane and the old, soot-stained human farmer, seemed to momentarily stun the combatants. Corgol, seeing his prize claimed and his authority challenged in such an unorthodox way, let out a roar of pure rage and charged. The fight was not over, but the war had changed. It was no longer just for a title, it was for a future. They broke the siege. They did not win a glorious victory. They fought their way out, a desperate, bloody exodus from the ashes. Graka's loyalists formed a wedge around them, and they punched through Corgol's disorganized line, melting into the woods as his forces were still reeling from the shock of the loyalists' uprising and their Thane's declaration. Corgol's angry shouts followed them until they were swallowed by the trees. They left the farm behind. A pyre of smoking timbers was all that remained of Elian's world. He didn't look back. There was nothing to see but ghosts. The journey into the Broken Tusk mountains was arduous. Elian was a liability in some ways, slower than the orcs, unfamiliar with the terrain, and still nursing his wounds. He saw the suspicion in the eyes of Graka's other followers, the 4 women who had survived. They could not understand their leader's choice. Why burden themselves with this fragile, aging human? But he proved his worth in ways they didn't expect. When one of the women twisted her ankle, it was Elian who knew which plants to mash into a poultice to reduce the swelling. When their rations ran low, it was his knowledge of snares and traps that caught them a pair of rabbits. He showed them how to find clean water, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to bank a fire so it gave off heat with almost no smoke. These were the skills of a farmer, a provider, a man who lived in tune with the land. They were not the skills of a warrior, but they were the skills of survival. Slowly, the suspicion in the retainer's eyes turned to a grudging respect. He was not a fighter, but he was a foundation. He was steady. He was useful. Graka watched it all, her face impassive, but he saw the quiet pride in her eyes. He was proving her choice was not one of weakness, but of a different kind of strength. Months passed. They established a hidden camp deep in the mountains, a base from which Graka began to rally other clans, those still loyal to her father's line and disgusted by Corgol's treachery. Her legend grew. The Thane who had survived betrayal, who had returned from the human lands with a strange, quiet human counselor at her side. Elian found a new purpose. He was not a strategist, but he understood logistics. He organized their food supplies, oversaw the mending of armor and weapons, and helped build their rough fortifications. He brought order to the chaos of the war camp. His hands, once used to tilling soil, were now used to fletching arrows and reinforcing leather armor. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk, his movements as slow and deliberate as they had been on his farm. He was still himself, just transplanted to a harsher soil. The final scene came on the eve of the great battle to retake the Ironfang fortress. The camp was a hive of tense activity. Warriors sharpened their blades, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke, iron, and anticipation. Graka stood alone in her tent, studying a crude map scratched onto a piece of hide. She was dressed for battle, her armor gleaming in the lamplight. All but one piece. A pauldron for her wounded shoulder lay on the table, its leather straps frayed and weakened. Elian entered the tent, holding a newly repaired pauldron. He had spent the last 2 days working on it, replacing the worn straps with fresh, supple leather, and reinforcing the iron plates. He had polished the metal until it shone. He didn't speak. He just walked over to her and held it out. She looked from the armor to his face. The moment was a perfect echo of that first night in his cottage. Him, the caregiver, tending to her armor, her wounds. But everything was different. There was no suspicion, no fear, only a deep, abiding trust. She turned, offering him her back. He lifted the heavy pauldron and settled it onto her shoulder. His hands were sure as he fastened the buckles, his calloused fingers moving with a familiar tenderness against the cold iron and warm skin. The touch was intimate, practical. It was the language they had always shared. When he was done, she did not move away. She reached up and placed her large, scarred hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. The warmth of her hand seeped through his worn shirt, a quiet affirmation. "You are ready," he said, his voice a low murmur. "We are ready," she corrected him, her thumb stroking the back of his hand. He had lost everything. His home, his peace, his solitude. But as he stood there in the heart of an orc war camp, his hand held by a warrior queen on the eve of battle, he knew he had found something far greater. He had found a purpose. He had found a partner. He had been a man living in the quiet epilogue of his life, and she had pulled him back into the story. A harsh, violent and uncertain story, but one they would now face together. He was seen. She had chosen. And in the heart of the storm, they had found their own quiet center.